What is the ultimate price of a dream? For 87 American pioneers, the price was their humanity. In the spring of 1846, they left the comforts of civilization, carrying fine wines, family heirlooms, and high hopes for a golden life in California. They were searching for paradise, but they found hell. Trapped in the frozen peaks of the Sierra Nevada, buried under 20 feet of snow, and driven mad by starvation, they were forced to make the most horrifying choice imaginable just to survive. This is not just a story of a failed journey. It is a descent into madness, murder, and the darkest taboos of human existence. Welcome to the true, chilling story of the Donner Party. The date was April 14th, 1846. The place was Springfield, Illinois, a bustling frontier town that sat on the edge of the civilized world. On this bright spring morning, the air was filled with a sense of electric anticipation, the smell of damp earth, and the rhythmic creaking of heavy oak wheels turning against the mud. A small caravan of wagons was assembling in the town square, preparing to embark on a journey that would become the most infamous tragedy in the history of the American West. At the center of this activity was a man named James Fraser Reed. He was a wealthy businessman, an Irish immigrant with a commanding presence and a dream of a new life under the golden sun of California. He moved among the wagons with confidence, checking the harnesses of the oxen, ensuring the canvas covers were tight, and speaking in low, assured tones to his wife, Margaret. To look at James Reed on that spring morning, surrounded by his family and his fortune, was to see the very embodiment of the American dream, optimistic, ambitious, and utterly unaware that he was leading his family directly into the jaws of hell. To understand the horror that would unfold months later in the frozen passes of the Sierra Nevada, one must first understand the intoxicating allure of the West in the 1840s. The United States was in the grip of manifest destiny, a belief that it was the divine right of Americans to spread across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Guidebooks and newspapers published glowing, often exaggerated reports of California. They described it as a paradise of perpetual spring, where crops grew with little effort, where land was free for the taking, and where disease was unknown. For men like George Donner and James Reed, who were already prosperous but hungry for more, these stories were irresistible. They weren't fleeing poverty, they were chasing greatness. The party that set out from Springfield that day was well equipped. In fact, they were some of the wealthiest emigrants on the trail that year. James Reed had built a magnificent wagon for his family, a two-story contraption that soon earned the nickname the Pioneer Palace Car. It was unlike anything else on the trail. It had a built-in iron stove for heating, comfortable sleeping bunks, cushioned seats, and an entrance on the side rather than the rear, allowing for easy access. Beneath the floorboards, Reed had stored luxuries that were unheard of in the wilderness: expensive wines, fine linens, and family heirlooms. He was determined that his wife, who suffered from severe migraines, and their 4 children would travel in comfort. The arrogance of the wagon was a symbol of the party's mindset. They believed they could conquer the wilderness with money and engineering. Alongside the Reeds were the Donner brothers, George and Jacob, and their large families. George Donner was a 62-year-old farmer, a kind and gentle man who was perhaps too old for such a grueling journey. He brought with him his third wife, Tamsin,
a petite, intelligent schoolteacher who planned to open a ladies' seminary in California. Tamsin was a woman of remarkable spirit. Before leaving, she wrote a letter to a friend in Springfield saying, "I am willing to go and have no doubt it will be for the best. For my children, I would do more." She packed books, sketching materials, and school supplies, intending to educate her children on the trail. The Donners, like the Reeds, packed heavily. They had wagons filled with bolts of colorful fabric, expensive clothes, and cash stitched in the lining of quilts. The journey began with a deceptive ease. The route from Illinois to Independence, Missouri, the official jumping-off point for the Oregon and California trails, was a well-worn path. The weather was mild, the grass was green for the cattle, and the mood was festive. At night, around the campfires, the families sang songs, the children played tag among the wagons, and the men smoked pipes, discussing the route ahead. They were just a few families among thousands. That year, 1846, saw a massive migration. The trail was crowded with wagons, a river of white canvas flowing west. They arrived in Independence in early May. The town was a chaotic, muddy, vibrant gateway to the wilderness. It was filled with blacksmiths hammering out iron rims for wagon wheels, merchants selling flour and bacon at inflated prices, and mountain men with beards down to their waists telling tall tales of Indian attacks and grizzly bears. Here, the Reed and Donner families joined a larger wagon train. They needed safety in numbers. The unspoken rule of the trail was organization. A wagon train was like a moving city. It needed a captain, a set of laws, and a strict schedule. The routine of the trail was established quickly, and for the audience seeking a slow, hypnotic rhythm, the daily life of the emigrants offers a repetitive, grinding cadence. The day began before dawn, around 4 a.m. The sentries would fire their rifles to wake the camp. The women would immediately begin kindling fires to cook a breakfast of coffee, bacon, and cornmeal cakes. The men and boys would scatter to round up the cattle and oxen which had been allowed to graze during the night. This was often a frustrating task, as the animals could wander miles in the darkness.
By 7 a.m., the cry of wagons ho would ring out. The teams of oxen were yoked, the whips cracked, and the great wheels began to turn. The pace was agonizingly slow. An ox team moves at about 2 miles per hour, a slow walking pace. For the women and children, this meant long hours sitting on hard wooden benches inside the swaying wagons, choking on the dust kicked up by the animals in front, or walking alongside the trail to spare the oxen the weight. The landscape of the Great Plains was a vast rolling ocean of green grass that stretched to the horizon in every direction. It was beautiful, but it was also monotonous. Day after day, the scenery barely changed. The sun beat down, the wind blew through the tall grass, and the only sound was the creaking of leather and wood and the lowing of cattle. At noon, they would stop for nooning, an hour of rest to let the oxen graze and the families eat a cold lunch. Then the march continued until late afternoon. When they made camp for the night, the wagons were drawn into a tight circle, a corral to keep the livestock in and potential threats out. Dinner was cooked, repairs were made to broken axles or torn canvas, and by 8 p.m. the camp was usually asleep, exhausted by the sheer physical toll of the day. Despite the monotony, there were moments of wonder. They saw vast herds of buffalo that darkened the plains, a thundering mass of muscle and fur that took hours to pass. They marveled at the strange rock formations like Chimney Rock and Scott's Bluff, natural monuments that signaled they were leaving the flatlands and entering the high country. Tamsin Donner
true to her nature, collected botanical specimens and pressed flowers between the pages of her books, finding beauty in the harsh landscape. However, beneath the surface of this orderly migration, the seeds of disaster were being sown. The year 1846 was unseasonably wet. Heavy rains turned the trail into a quagmire of mud. The rivers, which had to be forded, were swollen and dangerous. At the Big Blue River in Kansas, the party was delayed for days, waiting for the water to recede so they could build a raft to ferry the wagons across. During this delay, tragedy struck. Sarah Keyes, the 70-year-old mother-in-law of James Reed, passed away. She had been sick when they left Illinois, blind and frail, but she was determined to see her son in the West. She died under a giant oak tree, and they buried her there, carving her name into the bark. It was the first death, a somber reminder of their mortality, but they could not linger to mourn. The trail demanded movement. But the true antagonist of this story was not the weather, nor the river, nor even the distance. It was a man most of them would never meet. His name was Lansford Hastings. Hastings was a lawyer from Ohio who had traveled to California once and had written a guidebook titled The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. In this book, he promoted a new route, a shortcut that he claimed would shave nearly 400 miles off the journey. He called it the Hastings Cutoff. The standard route to California swung north through Idaho via Fort Hall before dropping down into Nevada. It was a long, sweeping hook, safe but time-consuming. Hastings proposed a direct line, leaving the established trail at Fort Bridger and cutting straight west through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Great Salt Lake Desert. The problem was that Hastings had never actually traveled this route with wagons when he wrote the book. It was a theory, a line drawn on a map by an ambitious promoter who wanted to encourage American settlement in California. James Reed had read Hastings' book back in Illinois. The idea of saving weeks of travel appealed to his impatient, ambitious nature. As the wagon train plodded westward across the plains of Nebraska, Reed was already advocating for the shortcut. He argued that it would get them to California before the snow fell, that it would be easier on the oxen, that it was the modern way. The older, more experienced mountain men they met on the trail warned against it. They called it a gamble. They said the desert was too wide, the mountains too rugged for wagons. One such warning came from James Clyman, an old friend of Reed's who was returning east from California. They met at Laramie. Clyman, weather-beaten and wise to the ways of the wilderness, told Reed bluntly, "Take the regular wagon track and never leave it. It is barely possible to get through if you follow it, and it may be impossible if you don't." Clyman knew the terrain. He knew the cutoff passed through jagged canyons and a waterless alkali hell. Reed listened, but he did not hear. He was a man accustomed to success, a man who believed determination could overcome any obstacle. He respected Clyman, but he trusted the book. He trusted the allure of the shortcut. By late June, the party reached Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming. They were slightly behind schedule, but not critically so. The grass was thinning, the water was becoming scarcer, and the easy rolling plains were giving way to the rocky, dusty foothills of the Rockies. The psychological strain of the journey was beginning to show. Tempers flared more easily. The constant dust, the bad food, and the lack of privacy were wearing on everyone. Yet they pressed on, driven by the sun setting in the west and the promise of the golden land. As they approached the Continental Divide, the decision point loomed closer. To the right lay the road to Fort Hall, the safe, established, long route. To the left lay the road to Fort Bridger, the gateway to the Hastings Cutoff. The wagon train was about to split. Most of the emigrants, heeding the warnings of the mountain men, would turn right, but a small group, led by the charismatic James Reed and the kindly George Donner, began to talk seriously of turning left. They looked at their tired oxen, their weary wives and children, and they thought of saving 400 miles. They thought of arriving in California in September instead of November. They didn't know it yet, but they were standing at the edge of a precipice. The decision they were about to make would not just save or lose time, it would determine who would live and who would be eaten.
The irrevocable decision was made on July 19, 1846, at the Little Sandy River in present-day Wyoming. It was here that the great river of wagons split. To the right lay the established road to Fort Hall, the safe, predictable, and known route that the mountain men had advised them to take. To the left lay the unknown, the route to Fort Bridger and the entrance to the Hastings Cutoff. Most of the wagon train turned right. They looked at the Donner and Reed families with a mixture of pity and confusion, waved their goodbyes, and rumbled off toward safety. They would all reach California long before the first snow fell. But for the 87 souls who turned left, the mood was one of defiant optimism. They were a diverse group. There were the Reeds with their palace car, the two Donner families, the Breens, a devout Catholic family from Ireland with 7 children, the Eddies, a young couple with 2 babies, and an assortment of single men, German immigrants, and hired hands. Since the original wagon train had split, they needed a new leader. James Reed was the natural choice in terms of ability and drive, but his aristocratic manner and his wealth rubbed some people the wrong way. He was seen as too pushy, too domineering. Instead, the group elected George Donner as their captain. He was 62, kindly and charitable, a grandfather figure. The group was officially christened the Donner Party. It was a fateful choice. A nice man was chosen to lead them when they perhaps needed a ruthless one. They arrived at Fort Bridger on July 27th, expecting a bustling military outpost. What they found was a shabby collection of log cabins with dirt floors and a corral. The fort was owned by the legendary mountain man Jim Bridger and his partner Louis Vasquez. Lansford Hastings, the author of the guidebook that had lured them here, was not there. He had already left, guiding a group ahead of them. But he had left instructions with Bridger. Jim Bridger was a businessman, and the Hastings Cutoff was good for business. If emigrants took the standard route, they bypassed his fort entirely. If they took the cutoff, they stopped here, bought supplies, and paid for repairs. So when Reed and Donner asked about the road ahead, Bridger lied. He assured them the road was smooth, that the water was plentiful, and that the Indian tribes were peaceful. He told them the desert crossing was only about 40 miles. He smoothed over their fears with the easy confidence of a man who had survived the wilderness for decades. The party, reassured, rested for a few days. They bought oxen, repaired wagons, and let the animals graze. They wrote letters home, full of hope. "The new road will probably save us a few weeks," Tamsin Donner wrote. It was the last letter she would ever send. On July 31st, they left Fort Bridger. For the first few days, the trail seemed to justify their decision. They moved through Echo Canyon, a stunning chasm of red rock walls that echoed the sound of the wagon wheels. It was scenic and easy. But on August 6th, the trap began to close. They reached the Weber River, where the canyon narrowed dangerously. There, stuck on a bush by the side of the trail, was a tattered note. It was from Lansford Hastings. The note warned any followers that the road down Weber Canyon was virtually impassable and that he was afraid his own group wouldn't make it.
He advised any following wagons to stop and send a messenger ahead to find him so he could point out a better route. Panic rippled through the party. They had already committed to this path. James Reed, taking 3 men, rode ahead on horseback to find Hastings. He found him days later, miles ahead. Hastings, who was guiding a group that was already struggling, refused to come back to the Donner Party. Instead, he rode to a high peak with Reed and pointed vaguely toward a different range of mountains. "Go that way," he essentially said. "Cut a new road through there." Reed returned to the party with the bad news. They had to abandon the canyon trail and carve a brand new road through the undisturbed wilderness of the Wasatch Mountains. It was a task of Herculean difficulty. For the next 21 days, the Donner Party ceased to be travelers and became road builders. They had to hack their way through thick brush, chop down towering aspen trees, and move massive boulders with nothing but pry bars and sweat. The road they built was a torture track. They were forcing heavy wagons up steep inclines that were nearly vertical. They had to double-team the oxen, using 10 or 12 animals to pull a single wagon up a slope, then lower it down the other side using ropes and chains wrapped around trees to keep it from crashing down on the oxen. The physical toll was immense. Men's hands were blistered and raw from swinging axes. The oxen were beginning to wear down, their ribs showing through their hides. The social fabric of the group began to fray. Arguments broke out over who was doing the most work. The timeline was disintegrating. They were moving 2 miles a day, sometimes less. Hastings had promised a shortcut. Instead, they were engaged in a slow-motion wrestling match with the geology of Utah. By the time they finally broke out of the Wasatch Mountains and looked down upon the Great Salt Lake, it was late August. The summer was ending. The air was already getting crisp at night. They were exhausted, and they hadn't even reached the desert yet. And the desert was waiting. Hastings had written that the Great Salt Lake Desert was a dry drive of about 40 miles. In the mid-19th century, a 40-mile drive without water was difficult but manageable. It would take about 2 days. The party prepared accordingly. They cut grass for the oxen and filled every barrel and bucket with water. They cooked food in advance. On August 30th, they left the last spring and ventured onto the salt flats. The Great Salt Lake Desert is a deceptive beast. On the surface, it looks like a flat, hard sheet of white salt, perfect for wagons. But beneath the thin crust of salt lies a deep layer of gray, sticky, clay-like mud. For the first few miles, the wagons rolled easily, but as they ventured further out, the crust began to break. The heavy wheels cut through the salt and sank into the gumbo mud beneath. The 40 miles came and went. There was no water. There were no mountains on the other side, only the shimmering heat haze and the endless white horizon. The mirages began to torment them. They saw lakes of cool blue water that vanished as they approached. They saw groves of trees that dissolved into shimmering heat. The sun beat down relentlessly, reflecting off the white salt, burning their eyes and skin. By the 3rd day, the water ran out. The oxen, crazed with thirst, began to stumble. James Reed, trying to keep his massive palace car moving, unhitched his oxen to drive them forward to water, hoping to return for the wagon later. But the oxen, smelling water in the distance, or perhaps simply going mad, bolted into the desert night. They vanished into the darkness, never to be seen again. Reed was left with his family stranded in the middle of the salt desert, surrounded by nothing but white death. The 2-day crossing took 6 days. It was not 40 miles, it was 80 miles. When they finally staggered out of the desert and reached the springs at the base of Pilot Peak, the Donner Party was a broken entity. They had survived, but at a terrible cost. They had lost 36 oxen. Several wagons had been abandoned in the mud, their contents, fine furniture, books, china, left to bleach in the sun. The psychological damage was even worse. The trust in the leadership was gone. Everyone blamed Reed for pushing the cutoff. Everyone blamed the Donners for being too passive. The group splintered into individual families, each looking out only for themselves. The us had become me. They spent a week at the springs, trying to recover. They searched for the lost cattle, but found only a few. They had to combine teams. The Reeds, now without oxen, had to rely on the charity of others to pull their wagon, or what was left of it. They had to abandon the palace car, the symbol of their ambition. They transferred their meager supplies into a smaller wagon. The humiliation for James Reed was absolute. It was now mid-September. They checked their provisions. The delay in the mountains and the disaster in the desert had eaten up their supplies. They did the math and realized with a cold dread that they did not have enough food to reach California. They were still hundreds of miles away, and the hardest part of the journey, the Sierra Nevada mountains, was still ahead. A meeting was held. They needed to send 2 men ahead on horseback, riding fast and light, to reach Sutter's Fort in California. There they could beg Captain Sutter for supplies and bring them back to the wagon train on the trail. It was a desperate gamble, but they had no choice. 2 volunteers stepped forward. William McCutcheon, a giant of a man from Missouri, and Charles Staunton, a bachelor from New York who had no family in the party but a strong sense of duty. They rode out on September 18th, promising to return as fast as possible. The wagon train limped forward. The weather was changing. The nights were freezing. On the horizon, the peaks of the Ruby Mountains were dusted with white. It was the first warning. Winter was coming early. The tension in the camp was now palpable. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. On October 5th, at a place called Iron Point, the spark ignited. The party was struggling up a steep, sandy hill. 2 wagons became entangled, one belonging to a man named Franklin Graves, the other to the fiery young John Snyder. Snyder, frustrated and angry, began to whip his oxen violently. James Reed, riding nearby, told him to stop. Snyder turned his rage on Reed. He raised his whip and struck Reed across the face, drawing blood. Reed drew his hunting knife. Mrs. Reed ran between the men, trying to stop the fight, and Snyder's whip struck her as well. Enraged at seeing his wife hit, Reed lunged. He drove the knife into Snyder's chest. Snyder staggered back. He gasped, "I am a dead man," and collapsed. He died minutes later. The camp was in an uproar. Snyder was popular. Reed was not. The cry for a lynching went up. They propped a wagon tongue up to serve as the gallows. They wanted to hang James Reed then and there. But Reed was armed, and his wife defended him fiercely. A compromise was reached, a punishment that was almost as bad as death. James Reed was banished. He was forced to leave the wagon train, to ride ahead alone into the wilderness, without a gun, though his daughter secretly slipped him one, without food, and without his family. He kissed his wife and children goodbye, not knowing if he would ever see them again, and rode west into the twilight. Now the Donner Party was truly leaderless. George Donner was too old and weak to command effectively. The strongest man, Reed, was exiled. The 2 strongest young men, McCutcheon and Staunton, were gone on the supply run. The 81 remaining members trudged onward, a ragged, starving, quarreling procession of doom. They reached the Truckee River in mid-October. The entrance to the Sierra Nevada Pass was right in front of them. The mountains rose like a fortress wall, gray granite capped with white snow. They were so close. If they pushed hard, they might make it over the pass in 3 or 4 days. But they were exhausted. The oxen were dying. The children were crying from hunger. And the sky was turning a heavy leaden gray. The air grew strangely still. The animals sniffed the wind and lowed nervously. On October 31st, the forward section of the party reached the foot of the pass. It began to rain in the valley, but 1,000 feet up on the peaks, it was not raining. It was snowing.
The trap did not snap shut with a sudden, violent clang. It closed with the soft, relentless whisper of falling snow. On the morning of November 1st, 1846, the leading families of the Donner Party stood at the base of the pass that would later bear their name. The sky was a churning mass of dark gray clouds, heavy with moisture. The temperature had plummeted. They looked up at the granite notch in the mountains, the gateway to California and safety, which lay only a few miles away. But the trail was gone. In its place was a smooth, unbroken sheet of white. The snow on the pass was already 5 feet deep. Stanton, who had returned from California with 2 Indian guides, Luis and Salvador, and a string of mules packed with beef and flour, tried to lead the way. They pushed the animals into the drifts. The mules struggled, plunging chest-deep into the powder, thrashing and panicking. The wagons were useless here. The oxen, weak from the desert crossing and starvation, simply lay down in the snow and refused to rise. The families tried to walk. They carried children on their shoulders and dragged bundles of bedding, sinking to their waists with every step. It was a scene of desperate, slow-motion chaos. The wind began to howl through the pines, driving ice crystals into their faces like needles. They were less than 3 miles from the summit, 3 miles from the downward slope that led to the Sacramento Valley. But in these conditions, 3 miles might as well have been the distance to the moon. As night fell, the storm intensified. They dug holes in the snow and huddled together under blankets, shivering as the fresh snow buried them. In the morning, the realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. They could not go forward. The pass was blocked. They had to retreat. Defeated, they turned back to the small lake they had passed a few miles earlier. It was then known as Truckee Lake. Today, it is Donner Lake. It was a gloomy, alpine body of water surrounded by dense forests of pine and fir. Here, they prepared to wait. They assumed, with the naive optimism of people who did not know the Sierra Nevada, that the storm would pass in a few days, the snow would melt, and they would try again. They did not know that this was the beginning of the worst winter recorded in the history of the region. They began to build shelters. They were not building for a winter, they were building for a temporary stay, which made the structures flimsy and inadequate. The Breen family took over an existing, abandoned cabin near the lake, a drafty shack with a dirt floor and a leaky roof. The Murphys and the Eddies built a cabin against the side of a massive granite boulder, using the rock as one wall and logs for the others. The Graves and Reed families built a double cabin further east. Meanwhile, the Donner families, George and Jacob and their broods, were 6 miles behind the main group. They had been delayed by a broken wagon axle. When the storm hit, they were caught in the open at a place called Alder Creek. They never made it to the lake. They didn't have the time or the strength to build log cabins. Instead, they pitched their tents and built crude brush shelters, covering them with quilts and buffalo robes to keep out the snow. They were arguably in the worst position of all, exposed, isolated, and led by a man, George Donner, who was now gravely injured. While repairing the wagon axle, his hand had been gashed.
The wound was becoming infected, the poison slowly creeping up his arm. The storm that began on November 1st lasted for 8 days. When it finally stopped, the world had been erased. The snow was not measured in inches, it was measured in feet. The cabins were buried up to their rooflines. The cattle and horses, bewildered and freezing, had wandered off during the blizzard and were lost in the drifts. Some were found later frozen solid, standing upright in the snow, preserved like statues. Others were buried alive, their locations marked only by the steam of their breath rising from small holes in the snow. The men spent hours probing the snow with long poles, trying to find the animals. Finding a cow meant meat. Failing meant starvation. Life inside the cabins settled into a grim, dark routine. There were no windows. The only light came from the fire in the hearth and the occasional beam of sunlight that filtered through the smoke hole in the roof. The cabins were crowded, smoky, and damp. The smell was atrocious, a mixture of unwashed bodies, wet wool, rotting hides, and pine smoke. There was no privacy. In the Murphy cabin, huge drifts of snow would blow in through the cracks in the walls, piling up on the bedding. By mid-December, the situation had shifted from uncomfortable to critical. The food they had brought, the flour, the bacon, the dried fruit, was gone. The cattle they had managed to slaughter were being consumed rapidly. They began to eat things that were not food. They took the raw hides of the oxen, which had been used to roof the cabins, and cut them into strips. They boiled these strips for hours until they turned into a thick, glue-like jelly. It had almost no nutritional value, but it filled the stomach and stopped the gnawing pain for a few hours. They boiled the bones of the cattle over and over again until they crumbled, then ate the crumbly bone paste. They caught the mice that scurried through the logs. The psychological toll of the isolation was profound. Patrick Breen, the patriarch of the Irish family, began keeping a diary. His entries were short, stoic, and terrifying in their banality. Friday, December 18. Beautiful morning, snow deep. Tough times, but not discouraged. Our hopes are in God. Sunday, December 20. Night clear. Froze hard last night. Milt Elliott came in. Very low. Hunger. The diary became the only record of time. Without it, the days blurred into an endless gray loop of waking, shivering, boiling hides, and sleeping. The snow continued to fall. Another storm hit, then another. The snow depth reached 12 feet, then 15. To get out of the cabins, they had to dig tunnels up to the surface. They lived like moles in a dark, frozen underworld. The trees around the lake were buried so deep that the men cut firewood from the tops of the trees 30 feet above the ground. Desperation breeds madness, but it also breeds one last, defiant act of courage. By mid-December, it was clear that no rescue was coming. The snow was too deep for anyone to reach them from California. If they stayed, they would all die. Their only hope was to send a party out on snowshoes to cross the pass and bring help. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. The group consisted of 15 people, 10 men and 5 women. Among them were Charles Stanton, the hero who had already returned once, Franklin Graves, who had fashioned the crude snowshoes out of oxbows and rawhide, and 2 young mothers, Sarah Fosdick and Harriet Pike, who left their babies behind in the cabins with their grandmothers, hoping to save them by bringing back food. Even young Lemuel Murphy, only 12 years old, joined the group. They left on December 16, 1846. It was a clear day. The snowshoes were heavy and awkward, sinking a foot into the soft snow with every step. They carried 6 days' worth of rations, tiny strips of dried beef, about a mouthful per meal. They carried blankets, but no tents. They climbed up out of the hole of the lake camp, turning their faces toward the white wall of the pass. Those left behind watched them go, tiny black specks crawling slowly up the immense white slope. They were the strongest, the healthiest. If they failed, there was no plan B. The journey of the forlorn hope is one of the most harrowing survival stories in human history. For the first few days, they made good progress, driven by adrenaline. They crossed the pass. They saw the vast snow-covered ranges stretching out to the west. But the sun was blinding. Several of them became snowblind, stumbling in agony, their eyes burned by the glare. On the 6th day, the food ran out. Stanton was the first to fail. He had been the strongest, the one who had guided them, but he was exhausted. His eyes were blind. He fell behind. When the group stopped to camp, he would stumble in an hour later. On the morning of December 21st, he sat by the fire pipe, smoking his pipe. He told the others to go on, that he would catch up. They asked him if he was coming. He looked at them with his sightless eyes and said, "Yes, I am coming soon." They walked away. They looked back once. Stanton was still sitting there, a solitary figure against the white snow, smoking his pipe. He never moved again. He froze to death where he sat, the first sacrifice of the forlorn hope. Then the storm hit. It was a Christmas blizzard, fierce and punishing. The group, now starving and freezing, lost the trail. They became trapped in the open, huddled under a single blanket as the snow piled up over them. They stayed there for days, screaming into the wind, some delirious, some praying. It was in this camp of death, as they called it, that the unthinkable finally happened. Patrick Dolan, a bachelor, went mad. He stripped off his clothes and ran into the blizzard, shouting. He returned hours later, subdued, and lay down to die. As he died, the others looked at each other. The taboo, the ancient law of civilization, hung in the air between them. They were starving. Here was meat. Someone, history is unsure who spoke the words first, suggested that they should cast lots to see who should be killed to feed the others. But they couldn't do it. Instead, they waited for nature to do the work. When Dolan died, they stripped the flesh from his bones. They roasted it over the fire. They averted their eyes as they ate, weeping, but they ate. And with that act, they crossed a line from which there was no return. They were no longer just pioneers. They were creatures of pure survival. Back at the lake, Christmas Day arrived. There were no presents. There was no feast. But inside the Margaret cabin, Margaret Reed had saved a surprise. Weeks earlier, she had hidden a small stash of food, a few cupfuls of flour, a piece of bacon, some dried apples. She revealed it now. She cooked a tiny pot of soup. The children watched with unbelieving eyes. They ate slowly, savoring every drop. It was a moment of supreme love in the midst of hell. "Eat it all," she told them. "It is the last." And it was. The new year of 1847 dawned on a silent, buried world. The snow was now 20 feet deep. The cattle were gone. The hides were running out. In the dark corners of the cabins, the breathing of the weakest was becoming shallow. The first death at the lake was about to knock on the door.
High in the wilderness, the forlorn hope was moving like a dark, disjointed organism across the snow. They had left the camp of death behind, but death walked with them.
By the first week of January 1847, the group of 15 had been whittled down. Stanton was dead. Dolan was dead. Graves was dead. Lemuel Murphy, the 12-year-old boy, died in the arms of his sisters, hallucinating about food. The survivors, now fueled by the flesh of their companions, pressed on, but the hunger returned, sharper and more demanding than before. The most tragic chapter of this specific journey involved the two Native American guides, Luis and Salvador. They had been sent by Captain Sutter to help the emigrants, and they had served faithfully. When the group resorted to cannibalism, Luis and Salvador refused to partake. They sat apart, starving, watching the white men and women eat the bodies of their friends. As the days wore on and the meat ran low, the eyes of the surviving men, William Foster particularly, turned toward the guides. Sensing they were next to be slaughtered, Luis and Salvador quietly slipped away into the woods one night, leaving trails of blood from their frost-bitten feet. Days later, Foster tracked them down. He found them lying in the snow, exhausted and unable to move, but still alive. With a cold pragmatism that defined the final stages of starvation, Foster shot both men through the head. Their bodies were butchered and eaten. It was the only instance where people were actively killed for food, rather than eaten after dying of natural causes. The taboo was not just broken, it was shattered. On January 17th, 33 days after they left the lake, the 7 remaining survivors stumbled out of the foothills. They reached a Native American village where the inhabitants looked at these skeletal apparitions with horror and pity, feeding them acorn bread. A few days later, they reached Johnson's Ranch, the first settlement in California. Of the 15 who started, only 7 survived. Notably, all 5 women had survived. The men, biologically burning energy faster to stay warm, had died at a higher rate. The survivors were unrecognizable. Their feet were black stumps. Their skin was stretched tight over their skulls. They wept uncontrollably, but they brought the news. The Donner Party is trapped. They are starving. The news electrified California. The region was in the midst of the Mexican-American War, and resources were scarce, but the horror of the story galvanized the settlers. In San Francisco, men raised money and supplies. James Reed, the man who had been banished for killing Snyder, had been trying frantically for months to organize a rescue. Now, with the confirmation of the trap, he redoubled his efforts. However, rescue in the 19th century was not a matter of sending a helicopter. It required men to walk into the same blizzard that had trapped the emigrants. The first relief party was organized in February 1847. It consisted of 7 brave men carrying backpacks loaded with 75 pounds of food each. They were led by Aquila Glover and Rayson Tucker. They fought their way up the western slope of the Sierras, battling snow that was 30 feet deep in places. They had to leave the horses behind and proceed on snowshoes. On January 18, 1847, the first relief crested the pass and looked down at the frozen lake. The scene was of utter desolation. The snow had completely buried the cabins. Only the chimney holes and erratic mounds of white showed where human beings lived. There was no smoke rising. A silence as heavy as the snow hung over the valley. The rescuers shouted. Suddenly, a hole in the snow opened up. A woman, ghastly pale and looking like a corpse, climbed out of the burrow. She stared at the men with hollow eyes and asked in a voice that became legendary, "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" The rescuers slid down to the cabins. What they found inside broke their hearts. The smell was the first thing, a stench of rotting hides, sickness, and death. The people inside were barely human. They were wrapped in filthy rags, their eyes bulging from their sockets. They were too weak to stand. The rescuers handed out small portions of biscuits and jerked beef, but they had to be careful. Feeding a starving person too much too quickly can kill them. In the Murphy cabin, the rescuers found Milt Elliott, the faithful teamster of the Reed family, dead. His face had been partially eaten by the starving survivors before they had the strength to stop. In the Breen cabin, the family was alive but lethargic, lying in the dark, clutching their rosaries. The rescuers faced a brutal calculus. They had very little food to leave behind. They could only take a small number of people back with them, those who were strong enough to walk but weak enough to die if they stayed. They could not carry anyone. If you couldn't walk, you stayed. This led to heart-wrenching scenes of separation. Margaret Reed was chosen to go, but she had 4 children. The rescuers said they could not take the 2 youngest, Patty and Thomas. They were too small to walk the snow. She had to choose, stay and die with them, or go and save the older 2, hoping another relief party would come for the little ones. She agonizingly agreed to go. As she left, 8-year-old Patty Reed looked at her mother and said, "Well, Mother, if you never see me again, do the best you can." On January 22nd, the first relief started back with 23 refugees. It was a death march. The refugees were weak. They moved at a snail's pace. Then, tragically, tragedy struck again. James Reed, leading the second relief party up the mountain, met the first relief coming down. For a brief moment on the snowy trail, the banished husband and his wife were reunited. It was a bittersweet joy. But Reed saw his 2 youngest children were not with her. He pushed on toward the lake, determined to save them.
When James Reed and the Second Relief arrived at the lake on March 1, the situation had deteriorated into a horror show. The food left by the First Relief had been consumed days ago. The survivors were now openly practicing cannibalism. Reed arrived at the Murphy cabin and found the occupants eating the body of Milt Elliott. At the Donner camp at Alder Creek, the situation was even worse. George Donner was dying, his arm gangrenous. Tamsin Donner, though healthy enough to travel, refused to leave her husband's side. She sent her children with the rescuers, but stayed behind to comfort George in his final hours. It was the ultimate act of marital devotion. Reed gathered 17 people to take back. This group included his 2 youngest children, Patty and Thomas, who were still alive, kept going by the scraps of food the Breen family had shared. But as they started the return journey, a massive blizzard, the Great Storm, hit. For 2 days and nights the wind screamed. The temperature dropped to 0. The refugees and rescuers huddled together in a pit dug in the snow, the starved camp. They had no fire. The wood was too wet. They had no food. When the storm cleared, Isaac Donner, a 5-year-old boy, was dead. He was lying between his sister and his mother. The rescuers, James Reed included, were now in danger of dying themselves. They realized they could not carry the children any further. They had to leave them. They made a desperate decision to leave the Breen family and several children, 11 people in total, at the starved camp, with a little wood and no food, while the rescuers raced to get help. It seemed like a death sentence. For days, the Breen family and the children lay in that pit, surrounded by the snow. Patrick Breen, the father, continued to pray.
When Mary Donner, a young girl, died, the survivors, driven by the madness of hunger, ate her body. The Breens, who had held out against cannibalism for so long, were forced to partake to feed their children. Back in the settlements, the survivors of the first relief and James Reed raised the alarm for the third relief. Two courageous men, John Stark and Howard Oakley, led a small group back into the mountains to find the people left at Starved Camp. What they found was a tableau of the macabre. The 11 people were still alive, lying at the bottom of the snow pit. They had lost the will to move. When John Stark looked down into the pit, one of the women looked up and asked blandly if he was there to kill them. Stark, a man of immense physical strength and moral fortitude, refused to choose who to save. He threw the blankets off the children, picked up 2 of them on his back, carried the provisions for the others, and shouted at them to get up. He single-handedly willed that group to safety, carrying the children down the mountain in shifts. By mid-March, most of the survivors had been evacuated, but a few remained at the lake. George Donner was too sick to move. Tamsin would not leave him. A woman named Lavina Murphy was too weak, and a German man, Louis Caseberg, had been left behind because he had an injured foot and could not walk. In April 1847, a 4th and final relief party was sent. Their mission was not really rescue, it was salvage. They expected to find everyone dead. They wanted to recover the property and the money of the Donners. When they arrived at the cabins, the silence was absolute. The snow was melting, revealing the layers of filth and bones that had accumulated over the winter. They went to the Alder Creek camp. George Donner was dead. His body had been wrapped in a sheet and buried in the snow. Tamsin Donner was gone. They went to the lake cabins. They found only one man alive, Louis Caseberg. He was living in the Murphy cabin amidst a scene of unparalleled gore. He was surrounded by the half-eaten bodies of his companions. There were buckets of blood. There were pots containing human flesh. Caseberg was wild-eyed, with long matted hair and a ragged beard. He looked like a ghoul. The rescuers asked him where Tamsin Donner was. Caseberg claimed she had arrived at his cabin late one night, delirious and wet, after George had died. He said she died that night of exposure. The rescuers were suspicious. They found Tamsin's money in Caseberg's possession. They accused him of murdering her for her flesh and her fortune. Caseberg denied it until his dying day, claiming she gave him the money for her children and that he ate her only because he had no choice. The rescuers took Caseberg, the last survivor of the Donner Party, and left the lake forever. They left the cabins standing as grim monuments. As they walked away, the spring sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the snow was melting into clear, cold streams, a cruel contrast to the horror that had just ended.
When the last of the survivors stumbled down the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada in the spring of 1847, the physical journey ended, but the haunting of their lives began. Of the 87 emigrants who had entered the mountains, only 48 survived. The statistics of the tragedy were grimly fascinating to the public. 2/3 of the women and children had survived, while 2/3 of the men had died. It was a demographic anomaly that would puzzle scientists and historians for decades, a testament to the biological resilience of the female body in the face of starvation and cold. But for those who walked out of the snow, the numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the silence of the friends they had left behind and the terrible secrets they carried in their hearts. The immediate aftermath was a media sensation.
Newspapers in California and back east published lurid, often exaggerated accounts of the cannibal party. The survivors were treated with a mixture of celebrity and revulsion. They were walking reminders of the fragility of civilization. When the veneer of society is stripped away by hunger, the pioneer hero becomes something else entirely. The man who bore the brunt of this public judgment was Louis Caseberg. He was the last man found, the man found surrounded by the half-eaten bodies of the Donners. He became the villain of the narrative, the human hyena. Rumors swirled that he had enjoyed the taste of human flesh, that he had murdered Tamsin Donner not for survival, but for her money. Caseberg was ostracized. He was spat upon in the streets of San Francisco. He spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name, eventually winning a defamation suit against a naval officer who called him a murderer, though the jury awarded him only $1 in damages, a symbolic victory that did little to restore his reputation. He died in poverty and obscurity, a broken man who claimed until his last breath that he had only done what was necessary to survive. Decades later, a chilling encounter reportedly took place. Eliza Donner, one of George and Tamsin's daughters who had been rescued earlier, grew up and sought out Caseberg. She wanted to know the truth about her mother's death. Caseberg, then an old and withered man, wept when he saw her. He swore to her on his knees that he had not killed her mother, that Tamsin had died of the cold, and that he had respected her body as long as he could. Eliza believed him. It was a moment of profound grace, a closing of the circle between the victim's daughter and the accused monster. The Reed family, by contrast, emerged as the success story of the expedition. Despite the banishment, the killing of Snyder, and the near death of his children, James Reed reunited with his family and became a wealthy landowner in San Jose. He even had a street named after him. But the shadow of the mountains never truly left them. Patty Reed, the 8-year-old girl who had told her mother to do the best you can, kept a small wooden doll in her pocket throughout the entire ordeal. That doll, with its painted face and tiny glass eyes, had witnessed the starvation in the cabin, the storms, and the rescue. Today, Patty Reed's doll sits in a glass case at the Sutter Fort Museum in Sacramento, a silent witness to history. The site of the tragedy, now Donner Memorial State Park, remained a place of superstitious dread for years. Emigrants passing through in 1847 and 1848 would stop to gaze at the tall stumps of the trees, cut 20 feet high by the Donner Party when standing on the snowpack, and shudder. The cabin slowly rotted away. The bones were eventually gathered and buried in a mass grave.
In recent years, modern archaeology has returned to the site to uncover the forensic truth. In 2003 and 2004, a team of anthropologists excavated the Alder Creek site, where the Donner families had camped. They found thousands of tiny bone fragments. The analysis of these bones told a heartbreaking story of desperation. The bones had not just been stripped of meat, they had been boiled repeatedly to extract every ounce of grease and marrow. The team found no evidence of roasting human flesh, suggesting that the cannibalism was not a savage feast, but a methodical, sorrowful process of boiling meat into a slurry to keep children alive. They also found slate writing tablets, broken china, and jewelry, remnants of the dignity the families tried to maintain until the very end. One of the most profound lessons of the Donner Party lies in the survival paradox.
Why did the women survive at such higher rates than the men? Modern physiology offers an answer. The men, physically larger and with more muscle mass, had higher metabolic rates. Their bodies burned energy faster. When the food stopped, their engines burned out more quickly. The women, generally smaller and with higher percentages of subcutaneous fat, had a natural insulation against the cold and a slower metabolism that allowed them to endure the famine longer. It was not weakness that killed the men, it was their own strength. The story of the Donner Party is often told as a horror story, a tale of gore and madness. But at its core, it is a tragedy of bad timing and bad luck. If they had arrived at the pass just 2 days earlier, they would have crossed without snow. If they had not taken the Hastings Cutoff, they would have been safe in California weeks before the storms. It is a story of what-ifs. Today, Interstate 80 runs right past Donner Lake. Thousands of cars and trucks speed over the pass every day, crossing in minutes what took the pioneers months of agony. The lake is a beautiful, serene vacation spot, popular for boating and fishing. But in the winter, when the tourists are gone and the heavy Sierra snow begins to fall, burying the picnic tables and the visitor center, the silence returns. If you stand on the shore of the lake on a quiet winter evening, when the wind kicks up the powder and the pines begin to groan, it is easy to imagine the smoke rising from the snow holes. It is easy to feel the ghost of a hunger so great it devoured humanity itself. The Donner Party reminds us that civilization is a thin veneer. We build our heated cars, our supermarkets, and our warm houses, believing we have conquered nature. But nature is patient. It waits in the wind, in the cold, and in the bad decisions of ambitious men. And as the 87 souls of the Donner Party discovered, when the snow falls deep enough, we are all just animals waiting for the spring.